Hi, and thanks. Thanks to Tehran and to the library and to the bookstore for organizing and supporting authors in an event like this. Thanks everybody for being here today. My book is on humanitarian intervention, which is essentially the use of force in defense of human rights. And it grows out of my experience doing human rights field work, including 2 years in post-conflict Bosnia in the early 1990s, or in the late 1990s, sorry, not to make myself sound older than I already do. So in the late 1990s. And then I came back to it later when I was doing my doctoral work. The 1990s, actually, in the following decades, represent an era of new humanitarianism, a time when there was greater global cooperation in international institutions after the end, or at least what we can think of as now, as the abatement of the Cold War. And especially we had a more active UN and a more active UN Security Council that was willing to authorize collective intervention. So think of examples like Bosnia, but also Rwanda, Somalia as sort of a failed effort, Kosovo, East Timor, as these kind of motivating and examples and cases from that time period. So these collective interventions involve military force, but which is often what's more familiar to people, peacekeepers, blue helmets, et cetera, but also massive efforts at stabilization and nation building afterward. And these are largely civilian field missions, and they frequently have a human rights mandate or component, especially again from the 1990s on. So I interviewed field officers that did that sort of human rights work, and also incorporate a lot of the key texts of intervention in my book. So we can think of these field missions as a good idea in many ways, motivated by humanitarian reasons, not wanting to stand by in the face of atrocity, wanting to help nations rebuild after conflict. And so there is a piece of that. But I end up more critical of the practice and some of the unintended consequences. So I just wanted to read a short quote from one of my participants that I think nicely sort of encapsulates the premise of the book, or sort of where I end up. This is a quote from an experienced human rights field officer, so someone who worked in the field in a number of field missions, especially in the Balkans. He was trained as a lawyer, really thoughtful and smart guy, and he nicely summarizes this. He's talking about Bosnia, which was an intervention that's generally regarded as a success story. And what happened in Bosnia was there was the creation of the Office of the High Representative, which, if that sounds like Supreme Commander of the world or Grand Poobah, it sort of is the same sort of an idea, a made-up term, but this is the Office of the High Representative, and the Peace Implementation Council, another sort of made-up ad hoc institution that essentially run Bosnia after the war. So he says, "This is the weird part, too, about doing human rights. You're in this weird position sometimes where you're really violating everything you say. Like in Bosnia, there were decisions issued to protect human rights, and yet they're not reviewable by anybody whatsoever. They're just promulgated by this guy who's been given power by the Peace Implementation Council. Who the heck is that? Where did they come from?" And that's the whole thing about this kind of transitional justice, which, as one of my former colleagues put it, as it's how to get to the rule of law without having it. And it's like we have to get to the rule of law, but to get there, we have to cut a bunch of corners. Scholars call this the rule of law paradox, and it runs through the major texts of intervention. And human rights field officers are well aware of it, as you can see. So my book sort of maps that out and raises fundamental questions about what it means to do humanitarian intervention and to do human rights in this way. So the last thing I wanted to say, so in much more detail, and I talk about a number of the different interventions, but one thing I wanted to say that I was reflecting on as I was preparing for today is I end up in a very critical place of these sorts of well-motivated interventions, but we're at a very different era now again from the 1990s and this new humanitarian intervention where we're actually pulling back from international cooperation and pulling back from international institutions and pulling back from human rights work in other places. So I wanted to just put that out there. And be happy to talk about that with people afterwards. Thanks very much.